Welcome to this online lesson looking at how the wounded were helped in World War I, the evacuation route. This is part one of a three-part series on this overall topic. The aims of this first part are to gather information on the evacuation route for wounded soldiers, to hopefully commit this to long-term memory so that you can remember it in the exam, and to relate specific knowledge to sources as well. After all, this is all part of the source of investigation of paper 1 in the Edexcel exam. Here's a do now task. Imagine that a man has been wounded in the trenches. Place the following events in the order that you would think that they would happen. Okay, pause the video here, read those events and see if you can sort them into order. After that, we'll have a look at the actual answers. Done? Here's what order they should be in. The first thing to happen would be that the soldier was wounded. Then the soldier would be stretchered away from the battlefield. Actually, very little was done to patch them up where they lay unless it was absolutely unavoidable. Once they're away from the battlefield, their wounds will be patched up so the soldier can travel. Then the soldier will be given more permanent treatment. Then the soldier will be sent to a hospital to rest and recover. And after they have recovered, as far as they can recover at least, the soldier will be assessed. If they're okay, they can be sent back to fight, or if not, if they're permanently disabled through amputation, for example, they might be retired from the army. Now, this is what is known as the evacuation route. It starts with a wounded man being wounded, actually in battle itself, and it ends with them either being returned to the fight or being retired from the army. Evacuation, if you think about that, is a way of kind of escaping or moving someone away from a danger area. And this ultimately is what's going on with these wounded men. Some key words to start us off then. Firstly, evacuation. In this context, this means getting the wounded away from the battlefield. Casualty. In a military context, this means anyone who is killed, wounded, captured, or missing. In other words, no one's really sure where they are. Often that means that they've either been captured but no one's told the authorities yet, or maybe that they're killed but their body hasn't been found. Here we're going to be focusing on the wounded though. Triage. The act of splitting up the wounded in order of how urgently they need help. You can see a triage organisation is in the photograph there. Your tasks then. Firstly, record and define each of these keywords. Secondly, study the list of wound types below and triage them in order from most to least urgent. As an extension, you can explain your choice for the most and least urgent. Heavy bleeding from a main artery, gunshot wound to the shoulder, stomach wound, soldier beyond help, already unconscious, broken ankle, smashed arm from shrapnel. Okay, pause the video here. Complete those tasks, and then we'll have a look at some answers. Hopefully you've recorded and defined all those key words now. Let's have a look at the triage system then. The first one that you should have put is heavy bleeding from a main artery. Yes, that one was already at the top, but I was seeing if you were on the board. If you didn't help a soldier who's bleeding from a main artery, they're likely to be dead in seconds or at most minutes. Then you would probably help out the person with a gunshot wound to the shoulder. Also, that one's the next one down. The gunshot wound to the shoulder would likely cause bleeding and you would need to stabilise this. Then the smashed arm from shrapnel. If the arm is smashed, they're probably not bleeding that heavily, so they're not going to die from that immediately. But they would need to be patched up before they could be moved properly, otherwise internal bleeding might result. Then the broken ankle, as that person isn't going to bleed out immediately, and it's probably very painful, but they're not going to immediately die. And then the stomach wound. But hang on, the stomach wound is arguably one of the most serious ones there. So why is that the last on the triage list? Well, sadly, this is the sort of tragic reality of the triage in the First World War. A soldier with a stomach wound was very often completely beyond help and unconscious, so don't waste your time trying to save someone who is impossible to save. They would be placed to one side, made as comfortable as possible, and left to die. Now, this rather complicated diagram shows the evacuation route in the First World War. We're going to produce a simpler version of this for our own purposes. The British Army on the Western Front developed a surprisingly sophisticated and efficient process for dealing with the wounded, step by step. Here's how it worked, and hopefully this diagram is a little bit more understandable. Its priorities were, in order, firstly to save lives. Secondly, to return soldiers to duty as soon as possible. And if 2 wasn't possible, to heal them as well as possible and discharge them from the army with as few long-term effects as possible. So how would this work? Stage 1 is to take the wounded man with stretcher bearers off of the battlefield. They'll be taken to a regimental aid post, or possibly to a dressing station just after that, in order to patch up their wounds and stabilise them for the journey. They'll then be taken by motor ambulance to a casualty clearing station. Now that's pretty novel. Motor ambulances were a really new innovation at this time. Still, an awful lot of transport in the First World War was done by horse-drawn wagons, but a priority was made to use motor ambulances for the wounded. Casualty clearing stations would provide more permanent treatment for soldiers in order to stabilise their condition enough to move them to a hospital. This would be done on a hospital train where, again, men could be treated on the move before they end up at the base hospital for their long-term recovery. There's a lot going on there, I understand that, so we're going to look at it stage by stage to try and commit this to your long-term memory. By hearing that once, you are going to forget it, I promise you are. So instead, we need to embed it by looking at it time and again, stage by stage, and by taking some detailed notes which we can then review. The more times you review information, the stronger those connections in your brain become, and the more likely you are to remember it. So our main task is going to be to produce a poster of information that broadly looks like this. Okay, it hasn't got the information on each section, but you get the idea. It's an inverted triangle showing the troops fighting at the front. So we'll list some of the types of wounds that they would suffer. Then the stretcher bearers to take them further back, the regimental aid post, the field ambulance and dressing stations, the casualty clearing station, for example, Liesentuck was one of the major ones in Belgium, and then the base hospital. If you are able to, now take out a textbook, this would be the Pearson Edexcel Medicine Through Time textbook, and have a look at pages 130 to 131. If you're going to do this independently and you have access to the textbook, you'll be able to listen to the following instructions and get cracking straight away with that more independently. But don't fear, if, as I expect many of you, don't have that textbook, I am going to give the information within this video as well. Your task is to create a diagram that shows the order of the evacuation route and how each stage worked. You must, for each stage, include detailed information of what stage involved and what treatments were available. You must also ensure that the stages are in the correct order, otherwise you've got it wrong. You should also indicate how big or how many of each stage there were. In other words, can you see the section at the top is widest? Troops fighting at the front is the largest part of that. Then there will be quite a lot of stretcher bearers, then there will be a smaller number of regimental aid posts and so forth. You could also explain how each stage was an efficient way of treating the wounded. By efficient, we mean it worked and it used the minimum amount of resources necessary to make it work. You may also illustrate and colour code your poster for clarity and interest. This is basically a process known as double encoding, and the very act of drawing little cartoons helps you embed it to the long-term memory because you're processing the information in a different way again. Bear in mind with this, you don't need to be a wonderful artist for it to be effective. In fact, your pictures can be absolutely rubbish, and it can work just as well, because you're just processing that information again. One quick note though, soldiers could be returned to the fighting at any stage of this process depending on the severity of their wounds. So for example, once the stretcher bearer has brought them back to the regimental aid post, they might be patched up, checked over, and then sent back to the front if they're okay. Equally though, if they get back as far as the base hospital, they might one day return to the front line, or they might actually end up just being retired from the army. If you're going to use the Edexcel textbook to do this, you can pause the video here and use these instructions to complete your poster now. If you're not, we're going to look at each of these stages with information within this video instead. So either way, you'll have all the information that you should need and you should be able to put it together. However, you'll be working at a sort of more independent pace if you use the textbook, but it'll work just as well if you're not. So the first stage in our triangle is the troops fighting up the front. Fighting in World War I was deadly and wounds were varied. If you haven't done any work on the type of wounds that people suffered in World War I, I've got 3 lessons on this earlier in the playlist, which I advise you to check out first before tackling this. But in basic senses, the main wounds of World War I included GSWs, which stands for gunshot wounds, shrapnel wounds, these are wounds caused by the jagged pieces of metal from shell splinters, gas, and cuts and stabs or lacerations, for example from barbed wire or from enemy bayonets. Also, blasts could cause damage. It could cause internal injuries, bleeding, broken bones, and so forth. And let's not forget illness and disease. The unsanitary conditions of the trenches could cause this as well. These men would still need treatment even if they hadn't been hurt by the enemy. Typically, a soldier's comrades would do their best to assist them until help arrived. After all, these blokes were typically friends and they really cared about each other. However, during an attack, such as at the Battle of the Somme in 1916, soldiers were strictly forbidden to stop and help the wounded, instead being told to wait for the stretcher bearers. This isn't quite as heartless as it sounds. The stretcher bearers usually had bright white and red cross logos on them, which would deter the Germans from shooting at them. It was seen as pretty bad form even in war to shoot at the enemy's medics and stretcher bearers, although it should be recognised that the stretcher bearers, as we'll see, are not the same as medics who are providing treatment. So it's not as heartless as all that, because if you stop to help a wounded comrade, you're just making a target for yourself. Instead of one man being wounded, there's likely to end up with 2 or 3. So, a reminder of what you need to include on this section of your poster. Probably a large sheet of paper is the best way of doing this. You must include detailed information about what each stage involved. So, what types of wounds are the troops fighting at the front having here? You should also indicate the scale of this stage of treatment. Were many people involved? Well, think about this. There were millions of soldiers fighting in World War I and thousands of them in single battles. And you could also explain how each stage was an efficient way of treating the wounded. What is efficient about demanding that during attacks, soldiers didn't stop and help the wounded? They should wait for the stretcher bearers. And I did say efficient. I didn't mean to say kind-hearted. Okay, pause the video here and complete the first stage of your poster or revision notes. Done? Let's move on to the next section. In any battle, a crucial component was the large number of stretcher bearers who would be employed in taking the wounded off the battlefield. Let's have a look at their role. Once a wounded man was down, it fell to the stretcher bearers to rescue him, assuming he could not move himself back. Stretcher bearers would rarely be deliberately targeted by either side in World War I, and often helped wounded soldiers of the enemy too. However, the dangers were great. Long-range bullets, machine guns and artillery were indiscriminate in who they hit. Very often, the stretcher bearers who were killed were not being targeted, they were simply caught in the crossfire. Stretcher bearers would often have to cross rough and muddy terrain and travel through cramped and often crowded trenches. This meant that wounded men bled to death on the way to the dressing station. A crucial invention was something called the Thomas splint, more on that another time, which helped stabilise patients with broken legs. Basically, this splint stopped the bones from causing lacerations within the leg and causing further bleeding which couldn't be treated. Stretcher bearers were sometimes conscientious objectors who wanted to help but refused to fight. They rarely had medical knowledge though, instead being used to simply transport the people who were wounded to those who knew actually how to help them. If you're thinking about the idea of medics, as you might see in the Second World War, where they give treatment right there and then when the soldier is hit, that's not really the case here. The First World War idea was to use a large number of stretcher bearers to quickly move the men back to the regimental aid posts where they could be helped better. Alright, a reminder of your tasks again. Within your notes or on your poster, include detailed information on this stage of the operation. Indicate the scale of this stage of treatment, remembering that there would be lots and lots of stretcher bearers in a major attack. And you could also explain how each stage was an efficient way of treating the wounded. Remember, and the photograph can help clue you into this, one stretcher bearer is not going to be enough typically to move one soldier back. You're often going to need 3, 4 or even more people than that to transport a wounded man back across no man's land. Alright, pause the video here and complete the next section of your diagram, your poster or your revision notes, depending on how you're doing this. Okay, let's have a look at stage 3. Hopefully you're getting the idea of what you must, should and could include now. Stage 3 is the Regimental Aid Post, or RAP. The Regimental Aid Post, or RAP, was usually within 200 metres of the front line, in communications trenches or in deserted buildings. The Regimental Medical Officer, or RMO, was in charge, with some help from the stretcher bearers, who may have had limited medical knowledge, often things that they'd picked up in the result of their duties. Wounded men either walked there themselves or were carried in by comrades or stretcher bearers. The RAP could only deal with minor wounds and tried to return as many men as possible back to the front line. So if, for example, you had a bit of a cut from a shrapnel injury but you had mostly escaped, then they might give you a few stitches and a bandage and then say, right, back you go, you'll be okay. If it couldn't deal with the seriously wounded, then it would need to go on to the next stage. So the seriously wounded would need to be evacuated to the next stage of the chain, which was known as the dressing station. More on that in a moment. For now though, let's move on with our tasks for this one here. Include detailed information, indicate the scale of it, and explain how this is an efficient way of treating the wounded. Pause the video while you complete this next stage, and then we'll move on to the dressing station. Stage 4. The dressing stations and field ambulance. One word of warning here. You might think of an ambulance as being a vehicle. Well, technically speaking, in Army speak of this time, the ambulance was the organisation evacuating the wounded rather than the vehicle that was doing it. The meaning of the word has kind of changed over time. In ideal cases, there was an advanced dressing station, or ADS, about 400 metres from the Regimental Aid Post, and a main dressing station about half a mile further back. But in the chaos of war, there was very often only one dressing station. Again, ideally, dressing stations were in bunkers or abandoned buildings to offer protection from the artillery, but sometimes only tents were available. Wounded men arrived on foot or were carried by stretcher bearers. You can see in the photograph here the remains of one of the real dressing stations, one of the better ones, which was made from reinforced concrete. This one is outside Ypres at a place called Essex Farm Cemetery. Yes, it is next to the cemetery where unfortunately the soldiers who could not be saved were buried right there and then. This particular one is particularly famous because it was where Canadian officer John McCrae wrote the In Flanders Fields poem, which many of you will be aware of. In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row. But I digress. The dressing station was staffed by 10 medical officers. These were known as MOs. Medical orderlies and stretcher bearers of the Royal Army Medical Corps, which was the RAMC for short. And in 1915, occasionally even nurses. These nurses who worked in the dressing stations were the women who were most often likely to be in the front line. And yes, some of them were killed in the crossfire too. Okay, I think you've got the drill by now. Pause the video here and let's move on when you're ready. So complete your notes, make sure that you've got a sense of the scale of this and explain why it's such an efficient system. Pause the video while you complete that. Done? Well, we're going to have a look at this in a little bit more detail because it's actually a really important stage. So prepare to add to your notes. Those working at the dressing station belonged to a unit of the Royal Army Medical Corps known as the Field Ambulance. This wasn't a vehicle, this is the term for the whole organisation. The vehicles were called the ambulance wagons. There's an example of one, a World War I motor ambulance. In theory, 150 men could be treated by a field ambulance, but many more were treated during major battles. Hooge dressing station near Ypres dealt with over 1,000 men between the 10th and 11th of August 1917. The dressing station and field ambulance was intended to stabilise the condition of the patient so that they could be transported to better medical facilities by horse or motor ambulance. They didn't have the facilities to care for men any longer than at most a week. More lightly wounded men would be returned to the front line where possible. Okay, pause the video again and add to your section on the field ambulance and the dressing stations. Before we move on, we're going to have a quick look at a source here. You could use this to add to your notes as well, or we could just look at it for further interest and as a bit of practice in interpreting from sources. Source C, from the diary of E.S.B. Hamilton, 19th of August 1916. Hamilton had been in France for over a year at this time as part of the field ambulance. At the time of this diary entry, he was working at an advanced dressing station on the Somme. Remember the value of diaries as sources. Very often they were intended to be private, and so people very often wrote in a very honest way within them. The dugout of the advanced dressing station is awfully overcrowded both night and day, and it is impossible to get it cleaned or aired. There were something like 800 people through there in about 30 hours the day before yesterday. This is far too much work for the personnel of 3 officers and about 115 men. The result is a lot of the men are done up and the officers seedy and depressed. So to get the idea of the pressures that the dressing stations and field ambulances were in. I included this source as well because I wanted to give you the impression that this wasn't like a perfect and clean system. Each of these stages had to work sometimes in very horrendous conditions, and they did the best with what they had. Okay, unless you want to add some extra things to your notes, we'll move on to the next stage of the evacuation. Stage 5, the Casualty Clearing Stations, or CCS for short. Like the field ambulance and dressing stations, there's going to be 2 screens of information on this, so be ready. Casualty clearing stations were located at sufficient distance from the front line to provide some safety from enemy fire, but close enough to be easily accessible by ambulance wagons. Often the CCS nearest the front would try to help the most critically wounded, such as those with head or chest wounds. Based in abandoned factories, schools and other buildings, the CCS was often by a railway line to allow the next stage of evacuation to happen quickly. Here's an example of a casualty clearing station. You can see the large white and red cross that's been marked out on the floor. Have a think about why they would have done this. Who would have this been for the benefit of? And here, sadly, is the cemetery at Leesentuck Casualty Clearing Station. Again, thousands of men simply weren't able to be stabilised, weren't able to be patched up, and died of their wounds. They were typically buried in quite an organised fashion in a cemetery adjoining. Okay, pause the video here and add to your notes. Done? Well, before we move on, that large red cross that's been marked out on the floor, of course, is to warn aircraft. A big collection of tents like that, possibly next to an abandoned factory, could be a tempting target for enemy bombers. Although bombers were slower and less heavily armed than their Second World War counterparts, a few light bombs dropped into those canvas tents would do untold damage. Again, the Germans tended to respect these signs, and neither side took advantage of this in terms of lying about it to protect other targets. It was seen as mutually beneficial to respect the medical facilities of each side. After all, even German soldiers, if they were captured, wounded, might be treated at a casualty clearing station. Here's a source as well to add to your notes, and hopefully to add a bit of interest and context. This is from Ward Muir, Observations of an Orderly, published in 1917. Muir was a Lance Corporal in the Royal Army Medical Corps and worked in a hospital in London at the end of the chain of evacuation. We orderlies meet each convoy at the front door of the hospital. The walk-in cases are the first to arrive. Many were either not ill enough or not badly enough wounded to need to be put on stretchers and ambulances. They come from the station in motor cars supplied by the London Ambulance Column. The few minutes which the walk-in case spends in the receiving hall are occupied in drinking a cup of cocoa and in having his particulars taken. Poor soul. He is very weary of giving his particulars. That means the soldiers' details. He has had to give them a half-dozen times at least, perhaps more since he left the front. At the field dressing station, they wanted their particulars at the clearing station and on the train, on the steamer, on the next train, and now in the English hospital. Let's have a look at some more information about the casualty clearing stations. On arrival, the wounded would be treated in 3 groups in a triage system. This helped the medical staff to make more efficient decisions as to who needed the most urgent treatment. The categories were the walking wounded. These men would usually be patched up and returned to fight. Those in need of hospital treatment. These men would need to go to a base hospital once they had been treated for any immediately life-threatening injuries and if their condition stabilised. And those with no chance of recovery. Tragically, those with no hope of pulling through were made as comfortable as possible and left to die, so that scarce medical resources could be dedicated to those with a chance of survival. The decision to do this must have been pretty heartrending for many of the doctors who ultimately just wanted to save lives. Okay, pause again and add your final notes to the casualty clearing stations section. Here are some final statistics which you might want to add. These are statistics relating to the casualty clearing station during the Third Battle of Ypres, better known as Passchendaele in 1917. In one of the earlier lessons we looked at this in context, so if you're unfamiliar with that battle, there is a lesson to help you with it. There were 24 casualty clearing stations in the Ypres salient. 379 doctors and 502 nurses were staffing these casualty clearing stations. More than 200,000 casualties were treated by them. 30% of the wounded men were admitted to the casualty clearing station required surgery to stabilise their situation. 3.7% of the men admitted died. So how far do these statistics suggest that the casualty clearing stations were effective? What do you think? Well, considering the severity of many of the wounds of people who had got this far, and remember they would need to be badly enough wounded to take this far rather than return to duty earlier from, for example, the Regimental Aid Post, 3.7% of all the men admitted is pretty good going really, given the quality of medical care available at that time. That means that over 96% of the people who were sent there, or to put it another way, 96 soldiers out of every 100 that arrive, do make it out of the casualty clearing station alive. Number 6. Base hospitals. Base hospitals were usually many miles from the danger of the front lines, close to the French and Belgian coast where men could be transported back to Britain. Originally, the base hospitals were intended to fulfil the role actually done by the casualty clearing stations in practice. Instead, base hospitals found that many patients arrived already operated on, so that was good for the casualty clearing stations. As a result, base hospitals developed new and improved treatments for the sorts of wounds that emerged in World War I, or specialised in specific wound types. This was a very efficient way of operating, and meant that medical care was constantly improving. Major offensive resulted in increased capacity. In 1917, 3 new hospitals with 2,500 beds were set up. Men would be transported by rail and sea on hospital trains and steamships. Once a soldier's treatment was complete, there were typically 2 options available. If they were past fit for duty, soldiers who were fully recovered would be past fit for duty and returned to their unit. The other is to be sent to Britain. Soldiers whose treatment needed to continue were sent back to British hospitals. From there, they might be discharged, which meant that the soldier would be discharged not only from the hospital but from the army too. This was typically because their wounds were too severe, for example when a limb had been amputated. And this covers the physical wounds. We'll have to study the mental trauma separately. Okay, pause the video here and add your final notes to your poster or your note selection. The base hospitals are really important, so make sure you get specific notes on them, get details of their scale and their scope, and also what made them an efficient treatment technique. Think about the way that they're specialising sometimes in particular types of wounds. Pause the video here and press play when you're ready to continue. We're going to have a look at a fairly extensive source now. It's going to be source A. It will appear on the screen shortly. There's a lot of information in this, so you might want to put this full screen and in HD if you haven't done so already. Read source A and refer to your Evacuation Route poster and all of your revision notes. Which stage of the route did Mr. Cotton miss? And as an extension, why might he have missed this stage? Then secondly, what can you learn from this account about each stage of the route that he did experience? Include details from the source. And then how useful is source A for understanding the evacuation route described on your poster? Remember to use relevant details, decide whether it has enough details in it, consider the reliability and trustworthiness of the author, and decide whether there are any limitations that let it down. Consider whether the real information is in there. Alright, let's have a look at this source then. H.B. Cotton was a signaller who served at the Battle of Arras in 1917. Remember what made Arras unique, by the way. If you haven't done my lesson on these contextual battles already, Arras was a battle where there was lots of involvement of underground hospitals. So if you haven't seen that video yet, maybe check that out first. He wrote this after the war as a record of what happened to him. He was awarded the military medal for his bravery at Arras. He was discharged from hospital as physically unfit for further service. His army pension was worth about £40 a week in today's money. Not a lot. Regaining consciousness after further injury, I, and several others lying around in similar circumstances, shouted as loud and for as long as we were able to attract attention. Eventually I was located by a party of 8th Lincolns making their way to a sunken road to collect rations. Stretcher bearers arrived in and conveyed me in fits and starts under heavy shell fire to the Regimental Aid Post, a dugout excavated into the side of a hill. There, clothing, or remains of clothing, and boots were cut away from affected parts with an open razor. One was examined by a medical officer, a yellowish liquid poured over the wounds, and copious bandages applied. Various particulars, rank, name, regimental number, etc., were taken whilst waiting to be taken rearward by the ambulance, often horse-drawn to a casualty clearing station, which was equipped with a mobile operating theatre. I was informed that I had received multiple gunshot wounds to both legs, right foot and right hand, and had lost a quantity of blood due to lying out in the battlefield without attention. Sometime after my first surgical procedure for the removal of the largest pieces of metal, this was mostly the shrapnel bullets, I, with many others, was taken to a nearby hospital train by stretcher bearers. After a long railway journey, or so it seemed, we were transferred to ambulances and taken to a base hospital at Camier. Later I learned it was a tent hospital. I soon discovered that I was in the danger ward, and my parents visited me for 3 days, I think. 1 or 2 operations were performed on me at this hospital, and I spent about 2 months there before I was fit enough to be transferred to Blighty. Thence, I was taken by ambulance to Calais. Lady drivers were then operating ambulances at the bases, and I well recall lying on the very narrow stretcher with 16 tubes in my various wounds and changing the gears by a not too efficient driver on a very indifferent roads. We were then unloaded and casualties transferred to a hospital ship. Okay, pause the video here and complete the tasks in the blue box. When you're done, press play and we'll continue. Done? So which stage of the evacuation route did he miss? Well, he went straight from the Regimental Aid Post to the Casualty Clearing Station, meaning that he skipped the dressing station. Why this was done is basically unclear, but it may well be that the Regimental Aid Post and the dressing station were one and the same in this particular setup. So what can we learn about from this account from each stage of the route? Well, hopefully we can see that his condition is first stabilised, he's given basic treatment, then more permanent treatment before finally recovering properly at the base hospital and being taken home. He notes that he was put in the danger ward. Well, what this means is he was put into the ward where people were not necessarily expected to survive, and that might explain why his parents visited him. Clearly he wasn't really with it because he wasn't sure whether his parents visited or not, and he could only remember things patchy at that point. So this man must have been very lucky to survive because clearly the doctors were not quite giving up on him, but not far off. So how useful is this? I think it's a fantastically useful source. It gives a first-hand account for showing just how many things were done to help save this wounded man. Apply that to the whole war and it shows what a massive organisation it was. But be careful of certain limitations. He's remembering this after the war. Although the memories would be fresh, he does seem to admit, or at least imply, that there were times he wasn't conscious and he didn't really remember it. So it's not going to be perfect. Finally, remembering the evacuation route. A quick acronym to remember the different stages is BRASH. Stretcher bearers, Regimental Aid Post, Field Ambulance or Dressing Station, Casualty Clearing Station, Base Hospital. So you can use the initials BRASH to try and remember those different stages. It's not perfect, but it's not bad either. If you prefer though, you could try a mnemonic. Here's a quick nonsense sentence to help you remember. Soldier's bad rap fails at casual humour. Can we tell what these different initials stand for? Stretcher bearer, Regimental Aid Post, Field Ambulance, Casualty Clearing Station, and then Base Hospital. Which one do you prefer? Do you prefer the acronym or the mnemonic? Decide now. They're pretty bad, but decide which actually works better for you by practicing it. As a challenge, come up with your own better acronym or mnemonic to try and help commit this to your long-term memory. You can use your notes to help you do this, but the shorter and snappier they are, the better. These ones I just kind of came up with on the fly, so maybe you can do better. If you can, pop it in the comments below. That's the end of the lesson though. So thanks for taking part. I hope it's been useful. I hope it's been interesting. And if it has, like the video and subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to remember to put your own mnemonics and acronyms in the comments below. Thank you very much and good health.